I hope y'all are doing well this evening. Um, this has been a tough week. There's been a lot going on in our family, lots of sickness. I'm sure that's happened to lots of families right now. But we're here and we're still doing okay. We're making it through, and that's what we're going to keep working on as things go on. So I see a couple of new people. Let's see, Scooter's iPad. That's what I see identified there. Would you introduce yourself to us?
Yes, my name is Scooter Mitchell from Houston, Texas.
Okay, great. What part of Houston do you live in?
Sugarland.
Sugarland. Okay, well,
Sugarland,
I'm
Texas.
actually in Friendswood, so
Oh, really?
not that far away.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's great. And I also see, let's see, Natalie. Um, could you introduce yourself to us also? There we go.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Natalie Bandini, and I live in Lubbock, Texas.
In Lubbock.
Yes, sir.
All right. Years and years ago, I lived in Brownfield.
Okay, not that far, not that far.
Not that far from Lubbock, no?
You might know my parents, Sean and Linda Tyler.
Oh, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
They're over in Africa right now, aren't they?
Yes, sir, they sure are. They'll be back on the 13th.
All right, great. Yes, I went to the training work in Dallas with Sean and your mom too.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, you know them from there, or at least going to church like at Farmers Branch.
Yeah.
So great, very good. Well, everybody, this is our second class in this series on grief. The first class we spent just kind of introducing ourselves and talking a little bit about the world of grief and what grief tends to be like for people. It's very unpredictable. Lots of things happen during a time of grief. There are many difficult and sometimes beautiful things to deal with as you go through a period of grief. This evening, I would like to talk about some of the different models of grief that have been proposed through the years. One of them that you probably have heard of was from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And it was called The 5 Stages of Grief. This was one of the first ones that came out. She actually brought this out in 1969 in a book called On Death and Dying. And she was really motivated by the lack of instruction that medical schools were giving on the subject of death and dying. And so she was trying to present some models of what happens during grief and how people grieve. Particularly, she was most interested in how the dying grieve their own death. And so a lot of this was written around that, but it was used more widely later on as people talked about grieving from the standpoint of the grief stricken. And so that's where that came from. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about that and go into some other models too that can help us to better understand a little bit about grief and how to help others get through that. Before we begin, though, I'd like for us to pray together. Lord Jesus, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for the blessings that you give to us. All of the things, all of the struggles that we've been through in our own lives that now guide and direct us and show us the way forward through life. Difficult things, joyous things, mundane things, all the things, Father, that have created this life that we live today. And most importantly, your influence and your love and the way that you draw us together in this life, not just with you, but with each other as well. Bless us this evening, Father, as we study these things, and help us to have a better understanding of what it's like to be a grieving person in today's society. In Jesus' name, amen. So, have you all heard of the 5 stages of grief? Have all of you had any kind of introduction to that at some point in the past? Okay, Angela says yes. And y'all are feel free to unmute and to respond. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible.
No, I have not heard of that.
Yes, I have. I didn't get it in just briefly. I didn't get a chance to introduce myself. Fortunately, I'm driving, so not turning on the camera right now. But my name is Angela Farmer, and I'm from Houston.
Okay, very good.
I live in Tomball.
All right. The other side of Houston from me.
Yeah, pretty much.
Very good. Very good. Anyone else want to add anything to that? If you have heard anything about the 5 stages of grief, I'd just like to know briefly if you have.
This is Natalie, and I've heard of it.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, one of the drawbacks to this particular model of grief was that people began in the 60s and 70s, particularly in the 70s, I guess going on into the 80s, began to use this in a very linear fashion. So they felt like that people went through the stages of grief one right after the other. And by 1974, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was trying to stop that kind of view of this particular model, saying that that is not the case. People don't go through grief in a linear fashion from one thing to another as they go through these stages of grief. It's really mixed up, actually. Lots of things happen in grief. Now, the 5 states or emotions of grief that she talked about were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. And so as people studied this and as she began to introduce it, it took on a linear sequence, so that first of all, the grieving person would deny that someone had died. And then they would go to a stage of anger because they were
Denied.
then they would move into bargaining with God.
Denied.
Right. And then depression and acceptance and so forth. So what she tried to, she wrote the book again, or started writing the book again later, and was trying to observe and make people understand that it's not a linear experience. It's a very mixed up experience, and people go from one of these, maybe denial, into bargaining, or maybe they start with bargaining, or they start with depression and move on into something else. So it's a very chaotic kind of way in which to grieve. So mainly what she was trying to get people to do is just to recognize that we need to understand how to cope with illness and dying, and how to cope as a person that has experienced the death of someone close to us, how we experience that grief. Now, for most of us, we have all gone through grief of some kind. I'm gonna just say that's the truth, because that's something that happens to all of us as we go through life. We begin to experience grief. We begin to experience death, dying, loss, from the time we're very young, actually. We may not have comprehended that in the same way that we do as we get older, but we've still experienced that. Now, let's just talk about that a little bit. What are some of the experiences that you've gone through as you look at these 5 emotions that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. If you can think back to a time in which you experienced the grief of someone, or something that you loved a lot, did you go through those emotions?
I went through the depression. I couldn't understand because I knew my brother was dying, but I didn't know it was going to affect me in such a way that it depressed me. And I knew he was ill, so I knew any day now that he would pass away. But after he did pass away, there was a strong depression that came over me that I could not understand, because being a Christian, we know that he's saved and he's in a better place. He's in the best place and he's at his permanent resident. But it took me a while to understand that depression wasn't a bad thing. It's just something that I couldn't hold on to if I was going to survive.
Right.
I
Okay.
had to let go of it.
Did you experience any of those other emotions too, like anger?
No, I wasn't angry at all, because the life that he lived, the lifestyle that he lived for a while, and he became saved, it was a blessing to me, because he had accepted Christ as his Savior. He wasn't living that lifestyle. So there was no anger. It was almost, I won't say happiness, I don't know the term to use, but I was relieved because he was a better person when he left there. Yeah. So I didn't bargain. I wasn't in denial. The only part that I actually really dealt with was depression. And that did not last a long period of time, but it lasted long enough to make me realize how much I missed him.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd like to add, with my experience. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes,
Maybe
ma'am.
the background. Okay, so very briefly, my first, I've experienced grief, in life, but probably my hardest grief was 2 years ago at the death of my sister. It's just 2 siblings, and my younger sister passed away unexpectedly. And so and she was like 47. So it was like a big blow. She spent time in the hospital, but it started out as a rash. And in February and by May, she was deceased, and they didn't have a diagnosis for what happened. And
Wow.
so for me, of all of that, the anger, because I too am a Christian and a person of faith, and it was just like, I don't get this,
Yes.
I don't get this, because she's also she was a Christian, and all of that went all of that. And so, and I mean Christian, like, not just saying, I'm talking, we walk it out, we believe God,
Mhm. Yeah.
not saying, not throwing out at anything, just it is. And so it was a lot watching her die, because I was in ICU with her, and watched her code numerous, from one time when she got to the hospital, and then the time 7 days later is when she passed. And so for me, it was like because I did not accept that this was the death process that I was looking at.
Mhm.
When she passed, it was like stunned, but at the same time, she has children and I have children. My kids were like her second kids. And so being, having to, being like, you have to maintain and uphold the group, in the
Right.
process of all of that, and so, but at the same time, feeling angry. God, why? I'm mad. She got babies. She didn't deserve this. All of that. I'm mad. I pray. I
Right.
believe. And going through that, the denial. This can't be right. It's like a part in your brain. I'm very analytical. I'm, a logical person. But in my brain, I was like, but I can just go get her out. Like in the back of my mind, it was a crazy thing, like, but I can just go get her out. Like, this is not real. I can just go get her.
Yeah.
And that went, it's, you can't act on that. It's not real, something
It's not
that
logical.
yeah, it's not logical, but in your mind, it's like, but I can just go get her.
Yeah.
I can just go get her out, and then we'll be fine, and we're just gonna move on, and we're gonna drink tea on the back porch like we're supposed to. And all of that. And then another thing I felt, and just recent, she passed in May 2022. Her husband, they had 3 kids. Her husband just passed November 10th, 2024.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and unexpectedly too. It's like, what, so thank you. But something else in addition to those 5 things I felt is shame.
Mhm.
It's like an embarrassment. And that has been probably the weirdest part of it, is the shame and embarrassment.
Why do you
Like,
think you felt shame?
I think I felt shame because, again, we're people of faith. So it's like, what happened? Maybe you didn't believe in them.
Right.
It's like
You
that
weren't strong
question.
enough in your belief.
Exactly. It's like that, that verse in the Bible, and no, it's not, because the word, but it still plays out. The enemy puts stuff in your head, and
Absolutely.
so, and I'm not a person that, like, wants all attention on me. And so, having people, all of that, it brought on a shame and embarrassment. Like, what did I do? It kind of like that verse in the Bible where the disciples or the apostles asked Jesus of the blind man, who sinned, his parents or this man? And then Jesus said, it was nobody did. It was because for the glory of God. But you feel that as, what did I do wrong? Like, did I not pray hard enough? Did I not fast hard enough? Was it something
Right.
in me that blocked it?
Yes.
And now is everybody looking at me like it's because I'm the oldest. And so I've
Yeah.
always been kind of the second parent. I was like her second mom. And so it was like, did I do something wrong where I couldn't fix it? I couldn't fix it.
Well, and that's true. We can't always fix everything.
Yeah.
And that's just one of the things that we do go through. And there's, that feeling of shame is certainly there. And it is something that a grieving person deals with, particularly the one who survives. They have that sense of shame sometimes. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Hopefully we'll get around to that. There is there are several different models of grief that I wanted us to kind of get into a little bit here so that we can understand some better methods of being able to minister to those who are grieving. One of them is something called the tasks of grief or the work of grief. Sometimes we don't think of grief as a work, but it is something that we all have to work our way through in order to get through this period of time and come out on the other side in a healthier way. This has been a good approach that I've used in dealing with people in grief before. It's kind of a five-step approach too, like Kubler-Ross had, but it approaches it in a little bit different way. This was from Dr. Susan Zonnebelt-Sminge and Dr. Robert DeVries, and it's called The Tasks of Grief. These aren't sequential. They're not easily accomplished. The work of grief is indeed a work, and it's a struggle. It's hard to go through. It's kind of like trying to put a complex puzzle together. And there's many ways to put a puzzle together, you know. So all of these pieces to the puzzle in a complex design, we're trying to fit that together and to understand what's going on. But I wanted to run through these. I had those sent out in an email too, so that you could kind of take a look at them and read them as we go through them. But first of all, the first task that people have to go through, and like I said, these aren't in any particular order, but they're just things that have to be dealt with. So the first one I'm going to talk to you about is just the acceptance of the reality of death. The fact that someone that we love is gone and they cannot return to us again. Now, it may seem obvious that when someone dies, we accept that as reality. But in truth, accepting it as reality in theory is one thing. Accepting it emotionally in our heart is something totally different. That can be a tremendous challenge for people to just wrap their heads around the fact that this person they love so much is gone and they can't come back. Another task that's associated with that too is to express all of the emotions associated with death. And there are a lot of them. And I know that if you've experienced the death of someone that you've loved, you know that there are a lot of emotions, not just things like the fear or the loss. They're not just denial, but there's also, like Angela was saying, there's the shame. There are so many emotions that capture us. But if we begin to bottle those up, that can just really complicate the grief journey even more. Another thing, another one of the tasks of grief is to sort through and identify the memories of your loved one. All those memories that you now have to find a place to store up and begin to move on, because they're not present anymore. They're no longer going to be an active part of your journey. So everything that relates to them from this point in time on is in the past. And that's something that's hard to deal with. But we need to make those things a very vital and rich part of the memory that we have of their lives. And so that's another work, another task of grieving that we need to help people to work through. And I'm not just talking about how we do it ourselves, but my emphasis in this class is to provide ways for us to help other people that we encounter who are going through grief to be able to do these things. Memory building is one of the most important things that we can do for people to help them to build the memories into something that matters and has made a difference in their lives through the years. Another one of the tasks of grief is to, well, now to identify who you are independent of the deceased loved one. Who are you now? And this is something that a lot of people struggle with. I've had older people whose parents have both died wonder if, well, are they orphans now? If a child has died, if one of your children dies, how do you answer the question, how many children do you have? If it's a spouse who has died, are you still married? Or are you widowed? Or are you single? How do you see yourself? I'm going to relate something to you from my own personal experience. My daughter lost her husband very suddenly. This has been about 10 years ago now, but lost him very suddenly to a heart attack when he was only 37 years old. And it was a shock to her, as you can imagine, and to us too. But for her, this question of who am I now was really strong with her. I can still remember the night she came and we were talking, and she said, I am a widow, but I'm only 34 years old. Trying to come up with an identity for herself and how to move past that. Reworking your sense of identity is a critical aspect of grief recovery. And it's something that we can help people to understand that this is something they need to come up with. It's okay. And it's okay to think about those things. It's okay to feel those things. Another one of the tasks of grief is to find a way to reinvest your life now without that person in a way that's consistent with your sense of identity, with who you are now. You have to come to the point where you begin to determine your own personal interests and desires at this point in your life without that person. And so some of these are some of the various things that we can help people to go through. I would like to ask for some input here too, but how might you use some of these things as you sit with people in grief and walk with them on the journey? What are some of the questions that you can think of to help them to bring out this information? Tell me what you think.
Les, maybe if you knew the person that passed, you could talk about a memory that you shared with that person, or memories that you shared with that person, particularly pleasant memories, So
Yes.
that's just one way I thought of.
Yes, very good. Remembering things about people. We have the idea that they don't want to be reminded. They don't want to hear about it. And that's not at all true. They want to hear people say their name. They want to hear those memories that you have of them. They are not forgetting this person. So they want to hear those things too. But what are some other thoughts that you might have? How might you help to draw someone out as they go through these particular tasks?
You know, this is Mary, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to take this class, because I volunteer at the Star of Hope. And not most of them, but some of the ladies who come in from the streets and trying to get their lives together, what troubles them the most is that their mother or someone that they love died while they were in the streets. So that's a good question, because I can't address it. I don't know how to um, minister to them in that way, because they ran off, they had this different lifestyle, and they're troubled by that. And that really affects their sobriety, because they struggle with such guilt. So I don't know how to, I like to hear what people would say to them, because I don't know, I just don't know what to say.
Right. How would you draw out someone like that?
Well, I just thought about something. This is Tyree Hunter.
Mhm.
Um, Using being led, of course, by the Spirit of God, you might want to let them know that their mothers or whoever is in a happy place, and that that at least their their um their prayers were answered. Um, we don't live to see all the prayers that we prayed to be answered. But one way I would think would give them comfort is that your mom prayed, and God knew when your season would be, to come out of something. Because there's nothing worse than a person, guilty, probably other people saying stuff. You don't know what drove them to that, other people blaming them for
Right,
that thing. And the main thing I would think of, that we're all subject to human failure.
right,
And to be reminded that God already knew, and that person is one thing, they're in heaven, they don't even remember all this stuff no more. You know what I'm saying? So to relieve them of the guilt, that is just one thing that will come to my mind, that they are happy now. God knew this. I know a young lady, her and her mother was into a big argument. It's been years ago, and her mother died on Mother's Day, and um, the last thing her mother said to her, "This is the worst Mother's Day I've ever had."
Yeah.
And she didn't go to drink, but she lived with that guilt. She was only like, I think, 18, 19 years old when this happened. And, she lived with that guilt for a while. Why did I say things that I said, not knowing that I don't think her mother was really that ill as far as she knew to even, pass away like that. But
Right.
yeah, yeah. So that's one thing that came to my mind, letting them know that God already knew their time deliverance, and then look them that the mothers, fathers probably looking down on them happy now, but they knew. And God knows our time and our season for deliverance. So that's one
Yes.
thing that came to my mind. Mhm.
And there are questions that we can ask people to help to draw those kinds of things out. You can ask them, what would you like to say to your mother now? If you could say something to her, what would you like to say to her? Or tell me more about how that made you feel. There's all kinds of questions. We'll talk some more about those kinds of things as we go through there. Does anyone else have anything else they would like to add at this point?
This is Rhonda. I've always found that it helps to ask, what is your favorite memory of this person?
Yes,
And that can get them to open up and start talking.
absolutely.
And it may help them through a rough spot.
Yes. I use that a lot with even my in my hospice work. I will talk to the families about their memories even before the person has passed away. We'll start talking about memories, and I'll ask them, what's something really special that you remember about them? What is something special that they were like? Because in my line of work, I don't really get to meet people until they are quite ill. And so I don't get to see them at their best. And so for me, it's helpful even for me to understand, but it's also helpful for them to process their memories even at a time like that. And we have great conversations, even sometimes tearful conversations, but great conversations about what these memories mean to them. Now, there is another series too of tasks, or actually what Dr. Merton Strawman called the cries of grief. And again, it goes back to about 5 of them. That seems to be the number that everybody uses when they write about grief and so forth. But they talked about the different responses experienced during a time of grief. And again, they're not linear. The degrees of intensity can vary greatly. But some of them I know that you would recognize for sure. For instance, they call the first one the cry of pain. The death of someone that you love is one of those pains that can just drive you to your knees. It can hurt so badly. And particularly if you've been with someone who experienced a sudden death, an unlikely death, an unexpected death. And if you've been that person who's experienced that kind of grief, it's a grief that can just simply paralyze you almost. And I know sometimes some of us have seen those kinds of things firsthand. It's almost like something's been torn out of you or wrenched out of you. And it's a pain that's physical, not just emotional, but it can hurt in a physical way as well. And unfortunately, it also doesn't happen just one time. It can come and go through the years. That kind of physical pain, the pain of loss, can reoccur over and over again. We talk about this when we talk about certain holidays that come up, like Christmas and Thanksgiving and those special kinds of holidays that seem to Mother's Day or Father's Day that just wrench the loss out of us again. Another cry that he talks about is the cry of longing. This just comes from an overwhelming sense of emptiness and loneliness that people during loss experience. For many, it's a loss that they've never experienced before. And again, that can occur at special times of the year. And you hear people say, I wish they were here. There is another cry, the cry for supportive love. And this is one that I think is really important for us to talk about as we talk about being helpers to people who go through loss and grief. There is an isolation that happens during grief that those of us who don't experience it or are not going through it sometimes don't appreciate as much. In a world full of people, you can feel so isolated. And those in grief have specific needs for love and support that sometimes aren't being met. And they may not be able to be met by just anyone. But we can still be there to be a part of that. What they need more than anything at a time like this is emotionally healthy family and friends around them to bring them that stability during this time. They need people who can reach out to them for months to come, sometimes even for years to come. they need to talk about the deceased person. They need to share memories. They need to use their name and to keep them alive during this time of grief. There is also a cry for understanding. This is a cry to just be able to accept and comprehend what's happened in an overwhelming time. Often in a time like this, one's relationship with God is disrupted, at least for a time. I know Angela was talking about feeling the shame, asking why these things happen. And we need to understand, we strive to understand how death can happen and how it can impact us so deeply. Or why would God allow this to happen? I would recommend a book to you, by the way, by Michael Card. It's called A Sacred Sorrow. And I would highly recommend that you get that book and read through that. It's about how we lament and how we mourn and grieve and how we cry out, why? And we ask that question. That's one of the questions that I hear so often, particularly from younger people who are dying. And I guess when I say younger, I'm talking 40s and 50s, although I've had plenty in their 20s also. But, you know, to me, that's just too young to be passing away. And we ask, why? Why did this happen? And then finally, there is also the cry for significance. This is a desire to see something good come from this person's loss. It's the process of transforming grief into growth. Grieving is a matter of beginning with the question, why did this happen to me? And eventually moving on to the question, how can I learn from this experience? How can I get through this? How can I go on with my life now? And when the how question replaces the why question, then we've started to live with the reality of the loss. But why questions reflect a search for meaning and purpose in loss. How questions reflect searching for ways to adjust to it. But I want to ask you this, who else in the scriptures asked why?
Job asked why a lot.
Job certainly did. He asked why often.
Yep.
David.
David, yes.
Mary and
Okay.
Martha.
Yes, Mary and Martha, very good.
Moses is another one.
Yes, Moses also.
Elijah's another one.
And Elijah, yes.
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, the
Weeping prophet.
the prophet of Lamentations.
Yes.
Naomi.
Yes, Naomi. That's good. That's good.
I don't know what her name is, but I think it was one of King Saul's concubines kept the birds and the wild beasts away from her two sons. Was that who that was?
I remember a story about that. I don't remember for sure who that was, though.
They were hung. I think David agreed to turn them over and they were hung. And she
Yes.
camped out by the corpses for 6 months or so And I know she had to ask why.
Yes, yes, very true. Very true. And what was one of the probably the most famous questions of why that we remember is Jesus himself.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Why have you forsaken me?
Yep, he sure did.
But that just shows us though that this question why is not an impertinent question. It's not something that God takes lightly. And I think I said last week, it's not really a question that's asking for an answer. It's a cry of protest. Why did this happen? Why is this happening to me? And it's really just a cry of protest more than it is one of those questions that has to be answered. And indeed, when you are helping someone and they are asking a question like that, they really aren't asking for an answer to it. And there's no answer that you can really give them. Why is an unanswered question. It's an attempt to make sense of something that just doesn't make sense anymore. But sometimes we think, do I even have the right to ask that question?
Yeah. And that in what you're saying, that makes so much sense because in this process, I'm here because I'm, to help my nieces and nephews and my kids who are experiencing this and how I can be a better help for them. For myself, of course, but also for them having those answers. But I remember, the questions of why and me having those questions, and it wasn't me like really looking for an answer because no answer is going to satisfy me because it's not like, oh, okay, I got the answer. Now I can reverse what has happened. So yes, that's an
Yeah.
aha for me. Thank you.
Yeah. Very good. And it's a good thing to encourage questions like that also, to get people to talking about those kinds of things, to reaffirm the relationship that they've had with these people. These are some of the works, the ways of processing grief that we all have to go to. And Mary, a while ago, you were talking about some of those the people that you help through Star of Hope, and they have regrets in what they've said or done. What are some of the ways that, and not just for Mary, but for others, what are some of the ways that we can help people to process through those regrets? How can we help them to express that?
Maybe to ask them why they feel that way.
Okay.
Get them started talking about that. And, if they're blaming themselves, if they begin to talk about it and share it,
Mhm.
that it will let them see that perhaps it wasn't their fault.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of hard to minister to them because the guilt that they feel that, I don't know, some ran off and some treated their parents pretty badly, used them, stole from them. And then suddenly they're getting their lives together and they have this regret of not, parents are not there to see them better themselves. And that really kind of hinders their recovery because they hold on to that. It's almost like, I'm not saying it makes them feel good, but it just seems like it makes them feel good if they're beating themselves up. So that's the thing that I have a difficult time kind of to explain to them that I believe that they're watching from heaven, you know, but that's not what they want to hear. You know, sometimes I just think they want to hold on to the guilt to make themselves feel better. I'm not sure though.
Yeah, I think to what you're saying, I think as a part of, when we talk about repentance, a part of that is truth. Truth is you didn't handle it right. Absolutely. And, there were some wrongs that were committed, but there is forgiveness for you. That person, you won't hear those words from that person. But what is really the end goal? Like asking the person, and I deal with, I have folks in my life who have addictions. And so it is, any barrier sometimes, to pull on barriers to try to be, even I'm trying not to say too much, but when Jesus walked up to the gentleman that was at the pool, he asked him, do you want to be made whole?
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes people don't want to be made whole. And so, but he asked him, do you want to be made whole? And then the gentleman said yes, but the gentleman then went back to reflect on all the 38 years nobody was there to help me, this, and this. And so it's redirecting. Okay, so if you want to be made whole, let me direct you to what's going to make you whole. Let's keep the main thing the main thing. The main thing is whole. So let me get you to the pool to make you whole, which is forgiveness.
Yeah.
But if you don't want to be made whole, there is nothing that I can say or do a way that's going to make you whole, because you don't want it. And you have a right to not want it.
That's right. When Jesus asked that question, seems like one of the oddest questions in the world. Do you want to get well? But some people don't.
Because
This is maybe
there's power in being broken. Because
Yeah.
to be made whole, now you have to be self-sufficient. Now you have to be accountable. Now you have to be responsible.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
There's parts behind being made whole that sometimes people just don't want it.
Yeah. Well, our time is just about up, but I want to just kind of draw this to a conclusion here. These particular models of grieving and so forth are not as important as the understanding of some of the things that are identified as important for us to process through when we go through grief. It is helpful to study these items, to know what they are, so that we can recognize that as we're talking to people who are going through a period of grief. But these models don't stand alone. Things are different all the time. There's a blending and intertwining of all of these various suggestions as they work together. And when you minister to others that are going through grief, it's important to weave that pertinent information together to provide the best outcome for them. And that means asking yourself questions as well as asking them questions, and being willing to ask sometimes hard questions to help them to process through this, but always in a gentle and loving way. Grief is about relearning how to live. It's relearning your world all over again. The world of those left behind is changed. It's not the same, nor will it be the same. As much as those in grief wish it could be the same, it just will never be the same again. So in addition to the loss of the person in their life, there is also the loss of everything familiar to them. So the task at hand is for each one in grief to relearn life in a new world. And folks, that isn't always easy. As a matter of fact, it's not easy at all. We go through that in some ways on a daily basis. Our life changes all the time. We lose people, we lose jobs, we lose positions. We go through changes ourselves all the time, and none of those are easy. But to lose someone that you love is one of the more difficult things to ever go through. So it's our task to lead with care and sensitivity and compassion so that the griever can face those issues and resolve them as they move forward and come into a new life for them. Now, next week, we're going to talk about a couple of different kinds of death that we typically think about the sudden kind of death when someone dies suddenly, and we're going to talk about that some. But there is another type of death called anticipatory death. That's actually the kind that I deal with most frequently because I work in hospice. But we're going to talk about those two things this next week a little bit and see where they lead us and how they can help us to minister to people in grief. Thank you all so much for being with me tonight, and I hope it was beneficial for you. I'm hoping this entire class is beneficial for all of us as we
God bless you.
as we try to minister to others. Thank you. Thank you, Scooter, for that.
Good night, Les. Good night.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good
We'll see you
night.
next week.
Good night.
Good
Okay, see you
night.
next week.